Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, and apropos of the season, we are going to circumambulate an archetype that is often underappreciated and is really very major, and that is the archetype of the fool. This is sort of like a centipede, and it has lots of legs, connecting it to the dummling in fairy tales, the initial card in the whole tarot series, the Fool. There's the trickster. We have comedians. It's related very much to the child, to the self, to the magician. We have a lot to walk around and explore today. Well, I've been sitting with this for a couple of days and Googling and reading and looking things up. I've come to appreciate so much how the archetype of the fool, who is often the underappreciated or underprivileged, sort of denigrated person from an ego standpoint, is often a very compensatory function in the psyche. That it's the fool who speaks truth. It's the fool who brings the unconscious perspective to sort of often rigidified kinds of conventions and morality. And the fool that is unafraid to face shadow.
It's good that you started there, I think, which is sort of the punchline, because I have a feeling that today's episode, we're just going to be kind of knitting through all of these different themes, but that's the underlying story, is that the fool brings that which has been disallowed or discarded or devalued in the rest of the culture.
Yeah.
And or in the psyche. And that's, I think, where we're going to keep on returning to, sort of like a theme and variation.
When I think of the fool, I think of the natural personality without the persona. That there's something about the lack of veneer that allows the ego to simply express over and over again, sometimes to some social cost, of course. But I think when somebody identifies as the fool or is identified as the fool, it relieves them of this pressure to be socially adapted. And when I think of so many, particularly New Age philosophies about ego annihilation, often what they're really reaching for is this dissolution of persona so that everybody can be real, quote unquote, which is a beautiful thing and a complicated thing.
There are these two aspects of it. And maybe one place to start would be the image of the Fool in the tarot, which is the first card of the major arcana. And it is, usually pictured as a young man kind of in the Rider-Waite deck, young man kind of stepping off into the world blithely. So there's a sense of innocence and naturalness about it that I think you were lifting up, Joseph. And there is this sense of kind of meeting the world with a real open-heartedness. I often think of the Zen concept of beginner's mind, that I don't have a lot of expectations. I don't have a lot of presuppositions. I'm meeting what I see in this very unself-conscious way. And it brings up this idea of this sort of initial wholeness that we kind of come into the world with. That's one aspect of it. And then there's the other aspect of it, which is that when we are that way in life, it can be wonderful and we can be foolish. I mean, sometimes you need to have a sense of canniness, of self-consciousness, of strategy. Being in that fool position, you can be stuck in an innocence complex too.
The idea of the fool as an innocent is what I was also associating to the child, of how wonderful and open and enthusiastic and innocence can be. And that image in the tarot deck is so evocative of, he has his little bindle on the back of his stick, and there's a little dog trailing his steps. Of the openness and open-heartedness is one part of it. And the blindness to realities of what are you doing? Are you thinking, or are you simply feeling? Is your enthusiasm going to also be your undermining?
You know, it's great that you brought up the relationship with the child archetype, because I think they are related there. It makes me think of a couple things. First of all, I'm thinking of the character in the story of The Emperor's New Clothes, that the child who says, "But the emperor's naked," is kind of an example of a fool. That person who isn't burdened by social expectations and therefore can speak truth. And on the other side of it, Deb, I think what you were just saying about, kind of careful if you sort of stay blind and you sort of stay unconscious to things, you can be trapped in the child archetype much longer than you should be. And the puer psychology that we've spoken about before on the podcast, I think can also be related to the fool. It's kind of when it becomes too rigidified and kind of outlives its usefulness, or it's clung to defensively, then we might be kind of shifting over into a sort of puer psychology.
I think a dimension of the puer psychology, if we go back to the platform of it, is the psychology of the divine child, which we have spoken to before, which is this precocious innocence. And when I think of, young children, let's say in my extended family, who will blurt out something that is socially inappropriate, but very true at the same time. And there's a bit of hilarity, but also everybody's uncomfortable. The parents are wondering what they should do about what the kid just blurted out. But that unfiltered, unconscious wisdom that is just making something known in the room.
Oh my God, can I tell a story about that?
Go ahead.
One side of my family is Catholic, but we are not. And we went to a niece's christening, and the priest was going through the credo. I believe in one holy apostolic church and all of that stuff. And he gets to the part where I renounce the devil and all of his works. And my son, who was, I don't know, he was maybe like 4 or 5, he said very loudly in the church, "Well, I don't." So there it was,
You had already infused him with a Jungian
compensatory. He was bringing in the compensatory.
But that's actually, the speaking truth it is one of the classic functions of the fool, yes, as a court jester.
Right. And we think of Lear's fool in Shakespeare. That the fool in King Lear, was the one that could speak truth when no one else could. And again, this, of course, going back to what you said at the beginning, Deb, this is compensatory. The fool can bring in that which is missing.
And in a sense is maybe on the minds of all the courtiers, but they wouldn't risk their lives to actually say it. Mm-hmm. So the fool, we could imagine, is connected to a level of the unconscious in the room or maybe in the culture.
Yes, yeah.
And like a shaman is able to blurt something out.
Mm-hmm. To say something that would be unspeakable or even unthinkable.
And put it out, like your son did, from a young child or someone dressed in an outlandish costume, that makes it palatable because it allows the listener to both recognize the truth of it and say, oh, well, it was just a 4-year-old child, or this is the court jester in his multicolored costume and his hat with little bells on it. So we recognize it without truly having to take it all in and take it as seriously as it might be taken had it been uttered by, one of the higher ranking people in a medieval court, let's say.
And I think that brings up something really important, that truth or unconscious material and power versus innocence and powerlessness, tempers it. The fact that a child says it and the child is not powerful or dangerous, then they can blurt out unconscious material and the group can contain it. But when you see a world leader, for instance, blurt out something in an uncontained way, it creates fear and alarm, because for them to be trapped in an unconscious place can make things really dicey.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about how when there is an uncomfortable truth that needs to be spoken, it usually doesn't come from those who are already kind of ensconced in power and authority. And so when there's something that the collective has let drop out of conscious awareness, it's always going to come up through these kind of unsuspecting little cracks. It's rarely the kind of leadership who's going to stand up and say, there's this thing that we've been doing that's wrong that maybe we should rethink. So it's the truth teller. It's kind of, I'm leaning into this sort of whistleblower thing. Whistleblowers are often people with access to information and with clear-sightedness about what's happening, but not necessarily with a lot of power, because once you have the power or the prestige, that brings with it this need to protect yourself and to protect your power. So again, it's this idea of the truth or that which is missing or that which has been disallowed. It kind of necessarily gets held by he who has been reviled or discarded, or at least not taken as seriously.
I think that there's something about absurdity and humor that lets it slide in under the defenses, which is kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Which is why comedians can and often will say things that would be outrageous in one setting and in a comedy club and timed in a certain way, it becomes an object of laughter and the release of tension.
So we're kind of in the realm of the trickster, and the fool and the trickster do have this relationship with one another. I mean, I don't think all fools are tricksters or have tricksterish attributes, but they're certainly tightly connected.
Very much so. And I'm thinking there's an overlap between the jester and the trickster as well. Well, the comedians access this especially brilliantly. And that makes shadow material funny. And it really it doesn't just slide in under the defenses. It just floods the defenses and goes right over the top and makes us sometimes howl with laughter or howl as we see, the big hero slip on a banana peel.
It makes us laugh at ourselves.
Yes. There are some people that have played fools. I'm thinking I think it was Tommy Smothers in the Smothers Brothers, who was the goofy one and the fool, and sort of said the thing that was idiotically all too true. Or one of my favorite comics, Tim Conway, who often played fools of just goofing around and not doing things right. And underneath it was a very canny trickster who knew exactly what he was doing.
So then the garb of the fool can be used by the trickster to make him look more innocent or more accidental than is actually true.
Right.
Yeah.
You can don the sort of disguise of the fool. I'm thinking about that TV detective who always sort of played dumb.
Oh, yes. Columbo. Oh, yes. He was a wonderful trickster fool in his rumpled, stained trench coat. I always wondered where on earth they ever created or found something like that, who would scratch his head and say, well, help me here, because I think I just don't really get it. But, you said you were out that night, but I have these weird photographs that show you in thus and such a place.
Right. So it doesn't elicit the same defensive reaction when someone comes at you as a fool. And, I'll say that is sometimes a valuable stance in the consulting room. To kind of adopt a Columbo sort of foolish attitude as a clinician. It's like, I wonder what about that?
I had
anything come up for you about that?
Yeah. I had a mentor who said everything comes down to whether you're Sherlock Holmes or Columbo. And Sherlock Holmes is sort of the magician, right? The other side of this polarity, perhaps, of Sherlock Holmes clickety 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 click. He knows it. He's got it, and
he wows you with his brilliance,
right? The enlightened, magical insights versus Columbo, who's like the dummling in the fairy tale.
And the thing is that when we're sitting with clients and we're like Sherlock Holmes and we get this insight and we think we know exactly what it is, it can be really effective to sort of just land that in the room and have the patient go, oh my God, how did you know that? It kind of constellates a certain sort of magician archetype, which can be useful. But in general, I'm more comfortable being Columbo because it doesn't constellate as much of this sort of analytic authority, which I'm always a little uncomfortable with. And it, again, is less likely to take away agency and power from the person that we're talking with. And then you can just sort of say, well, I wonder about this. I mean, I could be wrong, but, I wonder what you think about that, and then let the analysand kind of say, yeah, I wonder too.
And I think the other side of that is that there are places that we really just don't know, and so, there are things like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way myself, and so there's a genuineness back to that innocence, being truly open-hearted, not knowing, and curious about, well, help me understand how you got to 4 from 2 and 2. There may be something here for us to learn. There always is.
Another dimension of the fool, which I find delicious in my evil sense of humor, is parapraxis, which are Freudian slips. And in some of the most serious, incredibly intense moments, I or other people will slip up a word, and then all of a sudden, whether or not it turns into a moment of hilarity, clearly the archetype of the fool is grabbing the moment, and often for some strange purpose. And I'm thinking of a particular moment that I wasn't sure that anybody else heard, but so you can find this online, but Chuck Schumer is there in the Congress and he's making this very impassioned speech about the insurrection at the Capitol. And I heard this live where he says, "Make no mistake, there will be a trial. And when that trial ends, senators will have to decide if they believe Donald John Trump incited the insurrection." And I was like, I was listening to it live. I was like, oh my God, did anybody else hear that? But I can also imagine, there's this overwhelming amount of tension and, political stuff going on, and the unconscious just, unseats the moment by grabbing hold and saying something that's absurd and shocking and bawdy. And I think life is full of those little moments where the trickster fool just grabs your vocal cords and you wind up saying something that you think you didn't mean to say.
Or especially now these days when we do so much communication via text and little typos or autocorrects or that kind of thing is a whole new realm for parapraxis, I think.
Oh, drunken texting.
Yeah.
The stuff that comes out.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
Absolutely.
Deb, I want to go back to the theme that you keep lifting up about compensation and shadow and link this to an alchemical idea that the philosopher's stone is often found on the dung heap. So the thing of highest value is often found amidst that which we have discarded, which we have deemed is not really worthwhile. And this is why often in fairy tales, the fool shows up as the character of the dummling. Oftentimes in these fairy tales, there's a king and 3 sons, and the youngest son is the dummling. In Russian fairy tales, he's usually named Ivan, and the trope is that he does nothing all day but sleep with his feet up under the stove. So he's lazy. He's good for nothing. This is not what the culture values. Marie-Louise von Franz, of course, is sort of the goddess of fairy tales in the Jungian world. And she's written many books about fairy tales. And one of the kind of classic texts is a book just simply called The Interpretation of Fairy Tales. And she spends page after page after page interpreting the Grimm's tale of the 3 feathers, which is a really good example of a dummling fairy tale. And just very quickly, the story is that there's a king and 3 sons. And I think the setup is the king says, each take a feather and follow it as it blows on the wind. And whichever son brings back the most beautiful bride will be king, something like that. And so, son 1 has the feather that blows off to the east, and son 2 has the feather that blows off to the west. And the 3rd son, the feather just drops to the ground. And he has to go into the earth, and he finds there a toad, and he marries the toad, and it goes on from there. But he is the one who manages to bring back the most beautiful bride, because, of course, the toad in the end is a beautiful princess under enchantment. But she can do all of these different things that the mortal brides of the other 2 sons can't manage to do. So it's that part of our personality that isn't consciously valued. And this is true both on the collective level, that in our culture, which we've devalued, but it's also true on a personal level too. One of the ways of understanding this quaternio in fairy tales of the king and then these 3 sons is to associate them with the 4 functions. So that would be thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. And Jung said that one of those functions is dominant for us. And then we have an inferior function. And Jung said that the numinous often hits us through the inferior function. That the answer, when we're in an insoluble dilemma, the answer usually comes through the inferior function. And that's exactly what we see in these fairy tales. It's the dummling, the fool, who represents the inferior function, that which we're not comfortable with, that which is not refined, that which has not been polished and socialized, and we don't use it every day, but the function in which we feel foolish oftentimes, that we don't know our way around, that we get a little bit lost, that's often where the answer arises.
I'm thinking about this function in ourselves is when we get tripped up by our own inferior function. And of course, it's outpictured in fairy tales with the dummling finally being victorious, the one to solve the problem, marry the bride, find the treasure. I think it reminds us about the value of humility, because the fool is always upending dominant cultural conventions, or how smart or capable or well dressed or whatever we are, and reminding us, no, you're not that hot. You're just an ordinary mortal like everybody else. You're the one bumping into the door jamb or spilling your water all over the table at the elegant restaurant. It brings us down into a place that is just more regular old girl or guy, of the ordinariness. And I think that's what court jesters did in those courts that I've only seen this in films, but that's what the court jester's job was to bring down these elevated courtiers, or even the king or queen, to a level of just an ordinary mortal, aren't you, after all?
In those scenes, often the king and the fool are alone, that there's a kind of intimacy in the relationship where the king can become irritated at the fool, but there's a way in which the king is matching wits with the fool, that he's being challenged to come into that realm of the unconscious and to discern what the fool is saying, which is often in Shakespeare's fools encoded in a kind of metaphor and a little kind of quippy, witty poetry. So it's a bit of a Zen koan, so to speak, that's been offered, and often the potentate has to really figure out what the secret message is that the fool seems to understand, or seems to be speaking, I suppose, but may or may not really understand. In a sense, in that regard, our dreams come from that dimension as well, which is why dreams can often seem shocking, absurd,
and foolish.
But the inner fool is the one who speaks without the filter and often does shock the ego and give wisdom at the same time, if we can discern what's happening, if we can decode the language.
That's a lovely point. There are many people in our culture who think it's foolish to listen to dreams. And I know I have some analysans who come in and say, my friends think that I'm crazy for writing down my dreams. They think that this is just a waste of time. So there's a way that, in some sense, the fool is the unconscious, and that hopefully we're holding space to hear that voice here on this podcast.
And Jung tells of a couple of dreams from his analysans, of a man that came in wanting sort of a professional analysis because he was interested intellectually in all of this kind of theoretical stuff. The dream that he presented was of himself as a very sick person in a hospital with a nurse tending to him and terribly incapacitated. And that is such a great example of what you're saying of the dream says, makes a fool of him. No, you're not a vaunted, erudite intellectual who can simply be interested in psychoanalysis from a lofty position. You're an incapacitated, sick man in a hospital. That same function that the court jester provides I think dreams often serve that function. It's the unconscious.
And the audacious reorienting of the ego's sense of importance often.
Yes.
That we are frequently made lowly by our dreams. I think of all the dreams people have of defecating or sitting on a toilet, or their toilet's overflowing. It's kind of strange bathroom humor that the unconscious will often generate, and how humbling that is. That the ego is not being afforded an enormous amount of status, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Coming down into this idea that the fool could be a central archetype for the unconscious itself, I'm thinking about the etymology of the word fool, and that the etymology is a bit more profound than perhaps some more modern meanings. That the word fool comes from the Latin folis, which means bellows or leather bag, because that was part of the way that the blacksmith bellows was used. And also in the Sanskrit, vatula, it often literally means inflated with wind.
Mm.
So if we think about how profound wind is archetypally, in the Bible, they talk about the breath or the wind that moved, upon this dark, mysterious deep and became the primordial animating force. So there's a way in which we sense, even in the ancient use of the language, that there is a kind of secret movement and breath that the fool is bringing or is an emissary of, that carries the ability to heat up the blacksmith's fire, which of course humor and foolishness does heat up fire. People can get really fiery if they've been made fools of in one way or another, but it has an activating kind of energy.
So that's another part of this compensatory function, is that on the one hand, the fool can bring us down and make us lowly. But on the other hand, by bringing in that breath, unconscious, activating energy of the unconscious, the fool brings a new aliveness as well.
Yeah. Thinking of the line from the 1711 poem by Alexander Pope, that fools rush in where angels fear to tread, which I think brings up both of these poles that we're talking about. I mean, it can be really foolish to do something that's unwise, but Deb, your mention of this kind of aliveness, sometimes the spontaneous impulse that we have is just the right thing, even if it's foolish. Sometimes it is the thing that brings the answer or repairs the disjuncture, or allows us to be courageous in a moment because we didn't overthink it.
The example that comes to mind is Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk, who certainly didn't overthink his transaction around selling the cow for a few beans. And I'm also thinking about comedians and how court jesters humorously, upended people. And that laughter and surprise and paradox brings that kind of new vision and a non-rational, sudden apprehension in a new way. And we like to think we're a very rational kind of species. And it's the fool that upends things, surprises us, sometimes makes us fall on our butts, symbolically speaking, but shakes it up, brings a new perspective.
I thought I'd just share something from von Franz about the dummling, because it just gets at what we've been talking about, and it's just sort of in her words, which she brings a real depth to it. She said, we should always look at these stories as we do at the dreams of individuals and ask what conscious situation is compensated by such a myth, so such a myth of the dummling. Then you see clearly that such a story compensates the conscious attitude of a society in which patriarchal schemes and oughts and shoulds dominate. It is ruled by rigid principles because of the irrational, spontaneous adaptation to events is lost. It is typical that dummling stories are statistically more frequent in the white man's society than in others, and it is obvious why that is so. We are the people who, by an overdevelopment of consciousness, have lost the flexibility of taking life as it is. We have also an overwhelming number of stories where the hero excels through just plain laziness. He simply sits on a stove and scratches himself, and then everything falls into his lap. These stories also compensate for the collective attitude which puts too much emphasis on efficiency. Then those lazy hero stories are told and retold with great delight and with a healing meaning in them. And that is from the interpretation of fairy tales.
So I wonder if we can operationalize that advice. I find myself thinking about the ways that we might consult the unconscious at pivotal moments to make sure that not so much that the fool would rule all of our decisions, but that when we imagine that inner boardroom of characters that are all chiming in on whether we should take that new job or make some other substantial transition, to make sure that we have a fool on the board that's also bringing in the irrational, bringing in the voice of Mercurius, the outrageous, the spirit of the unconscious itself, which is, by the way, not always correct.
Right.
It may just fan, the embers, or it may introduce something, at a direct 90-degree angle that kind of reorients everything.
Right. It's certainly not that we want to turn our lives over to the fool. So, Joseph, in talking about operationalizing it, did you have some ideas?
Well, of course, we're talking about dream interpretation is something that's really congruent. And of course, Dream School, our educational platform, is absolutely a place where people can go to encounter that and even take the risk to be foolish, by the way. When people come into the forums and they offer their interpretation of others' dreams or they share material that they're not totally certain about, part of allowing the vulnerability of that archetype is finding a frame where that can be nurtured without criticism and be encouraged. So finding a community like Dream School or other communities where one can experiment with things that we are uncertain of is a way to do that.
Yeah. And I think, what you're getting at is that working with dreams requires a spirit of play. And a spirit of play is where we invoke the fool. I mean, that's where we dare to be foolish, is when we're playing.
Yes. And so often in dreams, as you've said so many times, Lisa, often the least reliable attitude is that of the dream ego. We're often flipping the dream on its head for the thing that doesn't make sense of let's look at it from that point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Would it make sense to drive your car off the road into the woods? Does it we wouldn't want anybody to, rob a bank, but maybe in the dream, what if we looked at it from the point of view
of the bank robber, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we really are taking the stance of the fool, and it takes some practice to be able to enter a dream like that, and it does take, it goes against our ego attitude. So anything that goes against the ego attitude is going to be a little bit of a hard sell, and that's why it does take a kind of learning how to work with dreams. Really does take a kind of practiced approach, and Dream School does kind of help you along in that process.
Another operationalizing curiosity would be to just notice what you've been laughing about lately. I'm always curious when I'm watching a movie and something just makes me burst out in laughter. I mean, I like to enjoy it in the moment, but if I have a few seconds afterward to just analyze myself and say, well, why was that so funny?
Yeah, that's
relative
great.
to my own psychology.
Mm-hmm. And it might be that you have to find places where you allow yourself to play too, whether it's that you have wanted to take a dance class and you finally let yourself do that, or
and look like an idiot, or
look like an
feel
idiot.
yeah.
The other thing is to do something that involves your inferior function. So I don't have much of a sensate function, for example. So doing something like, I don't know, working with clay, that's really sensate, it's just it's not going to pull on skills that I have developed. It's not going to pull on skills in which I feel comfortable. It's going to really put me out of my comfort zone, and I will be a fool. I will be a beginner, and I'll have to just see what comes up with that.
I think that's brilliant. I think this idea of taking your Myers-Briggs typology test and then looking at what the inferior function is and how can we press into that, and to expect that the spirit of the fool will need to companion us. And if we can redeem feeling foolish and lift that up as a state of the unexpected, the state of the thing that is not congruent with how I perceive myself, the energy that brings forward the shocking thing, and welcome that, just as you said, into the art studio if we're not generally artistic, or into the writer's studio if we've never written before, and to really both to risk it, but even more importantly, to welcome it. I had an experience, it was probably now about a year ago, where I had a weekend where I just had nothing to do down in North Carolina, and I went to a local arts center, and they were doing a ring making class, and which is not something I'd ever been really interested in, but it was something to do for a weekend. So the teacher's being very meticulous, and people want to make really beautiful things, and I'm just churning them out, making all kinds of bizarre things, anything that comes into my mind. And the teacher walks over and she goes, "Well, I really could help you make something beautiful." And I started laughing and I said, but there are no consequences in my doing it this way, which is utterly liberating.
Yeah.
So I have this bowl of these ridiculous rings that I had made in that workshop that nobody would want to wear, but it was so fun to just do whatever I wanted, my unconscious wanted to do.
Yeah.
Because there were no repercussions.
Well, and that brings up such a crucial aspect of the fool, which is that it's process. The fool is on a journey. He's not looking for outcomes, goals. There's no strategic planning process. It's just go with the life flow. And that's what you did in your ring making workshop. You were just playing. What do you care? It's not goal oriented. Although the teacher wanted to
help me along there a little bit. But people love those YouTube videos of people that have made ridiculous cakes. They're like failures of other things, and ridiculous clothing and ridiculous hats, and just that ability to not have to meet the culture's standard of what's beautiful or what's expected. And that's the spirit of the fool that I think can be liberating.
Yes. To drop our outcome goal-oriented orientation.
So maybe it's a time to transition into a dream.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Are Our dreamer is a 65-year-old male who works as a TV director, and here's his dream. I dreamed I was in graduate school and had been there for a long time, drifting. I'm not even sure what I was studying. I was wandering around a large parking structure looking for my car, and I couldn't find it. I kept using my key to lock it and then listened for the chirp, but it seemed very distant. Then I went into an elevator that seemed to move sideways before it finally started going up. I got out of the elevator and wandered into an empty classroom and sat at a table and wrote in a notebook, but it was just odd musings, like random lines of poetry. A young woman sat next to me. She put her hand on my hand and asked me what I was studying. I told her I did not know. I told her I did not know where my car was or what dorm I lived in. She said she would help me, and we started to wander through the structure together. It was like an Escher painting. The woman was flirtatious, and I told her she was barking up the wrong tree. I'm gay. But she did not seem deterred. We went to the lobby of the building, where there were tables with computers on them and packages in a corner. There were several packages for me, wrapped Christmas gifts from my family from earlier years that I'd never picked up. No one seemed to know where my room was, but I went back alone into the structure and continued to wander. Finally, I met two young men who led me to my room. Then I gradually realized I was dreaming and woke up. And here's a bit of context. I have been widowed since 2014. My husband died by suicide after many years of struggle with mental illness. The pandemic seemed like practice retirement and maybe contemplate what comes next in my life. The main feelings in the dream were a detached frustration. And he explains a bit more. I frequently dream of not being finished with my education, having unfinished classes, things like that.
Well, I want to start off by saying that I'm really tremendously touched by this dream and this dreamer's life situation, and it's a very moving dream for me. It has a lot of feeling in it, and I feel like it's so cinematographic, and I feel like every single sentence has got stuff in it. So I sort of feel like we should probably go through it kind of slowly. So even just the first sentence, I dreamed I was in graduate school and had been there for a long time, drifting.
That word drifting carries such a feeling.
Yes.
That I'm there, but my encounter with what's happening is subtle and not vigorous.
Well, there's a directionless about it.
Mm-hmm. Being carried by a current, or maybe not moving at all, like the Sargassum Sea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it is a pretty common dream theme to find yourself back in school. And, we can sort of think, well, there's something you didn't learn. There's something you need to go back and learn.
The term that comes to mind with the first two sentences, because he adds, I'm not even sure what I was studying, is this feeling of being rudderless.
Yes.
And I often will use that when I'm counseling certain people, because the idea of the rudder is so important. Because the boat can be bobbing around on the water, we're not sinking. We have this potential, and maybe even the wind is blowing, but the rudder is what allows the ship to be guided by the conscious mind. That we can choose to harness the energy of the wind to move right or left or to tack, something like that. The rudder is an excellent metaphor for the role of the ego.
Yeah, and this streamer says that he's contemplating what comes next.
Mm-hmm.
And so there may be a real sense of rudderlessness.
I have a kind of a hunch about the underlying feeling that this dream may be lifting up, which is his grief. That his husband died by committing suicide, which is a most painful kind of loss. It just amps up the feelings of grief and loss. And then there was the husband's history of mental illness and struggle with that. my fantasy here is that now, well, he's back in graduate school. He's graduated from something. He's not in college, and people dream of being back in high school or even elementary school. So I'm kind of landing on the fact that it's graduate school, and he is drifting. He is wandering. He has musings. He's not sure what he's studying, but he's in a learning environment of some kind as he tries in his waking life to contemplate what will come next. And I'm so appreciating, schools are such containers, and people do often dream of being back in school. What does he need to learn?
Yeah, I think you're right, Deb. I think that my hunch too is that the grief sort of underlies this and coming to terms with the end of the relationship. But obviously, that's a tremendous job. The next scene that we have is he's in a parking structure. So his car is parked.
Yep.
The way we move through the world is it's parked somewhere. The libido, the life force that propels us forward is there. It's there. He can't quite find it right now. It's a little distant.
This theme, I think, is repeated in a way of that he gets into an elevator that moves sideways before finally going up. And then he's in an empty classroom. So these are repeated images of either a lack of libido or kind of misdirected libido.
Well, when I think about losing things, by the way, I have frequently not been able to find my car, so I have visceral memories of like not paying attention, that I'm so wrapped up in where I'm going that I don't make a clear mental impression of where I've left the car. So it suggests this kind of future orientation that then comes to bite us in the butt later on when we need to go back and gather something we've left behind. But I also feel like the unconscious is involved with the process of forgetting and decisive forgetting. The unconscious can grab something and pull it away from us in order to force us to remain someplace or to have a different kind of experience than the ego would normally choose. So we might also say he feels like he's drifting. The ego decides, oh, I'm done with this. I'm going to drive off. And the unconscious makes the decision, I'm not going to let you do that. And one of the primary tools of the unconscious is taking hold of consciousness states and, moving them around without our permission.
So this would be a little bit similar to the tarot card, the Hanged Man. Yeah, I'm gonna lay you up. You just have to be here right now. There's no forward movement possible right now.
Right. A divine intervention, in a sense, of being here.
So the woman.
Yes.
The woman comes and she seems feeling full.
Yes. She put her hand on my hand and asked me what I was studying. And the dream ego responds to her. They have a conversation. He says, I don't know what I'm studying, and I don't know where my car is. I don't know what dorm I live in. And she said she would help me.
She takes him down to the ground floor.
Yeah.
So she kind of regrounds him, and she shows him the table with the Christmas gifts from his family that he hasn't seen before.
This is the ghost of Christmas past coming back and bringing him to these moments of beauty or charm, these gifts that he had left behind, much like Scrooge had not been able to remember that he had once been in love or been jilted or had once been lonely or felt joy.
Joseph, I really like that. And I think, so there's something there from the past connected with family that he's gotten disconnected from, that then this image of this woman, which might possibly be an anima figure, is going to help him find again.
And I think that the superficial treatment of the anima image makes it too often an erotic image, because that's where many people in the culture experience it first, is in this romantic love. The first anima manifestation is the mother, and then the individual personalized feminine constellates out of the mother, the great mother. And then once it constellates out, it can show up as the lover, the priestess, but it can also show up as the sister, as the friend who is companioning us and sharing resources and is providing care outside of that sexualized dimension of the feminine. And I think that for this man to recognize that, even though she's quote unquote barking up the wrong tree, he does allow her to help him and companion him. So I think this is an initiation into a different relationship with the feminine that allows it categorically to be in him and with him.
And, the scene is set where there's this kind of loss of libido. There's this directionlessness. There's this difficulty in accessing life energy. And then she comes along and she's flirtatious. So there's a liveliness there. So something has arisen in the psyche that seems to restoring contact, perhaps, with a sense of aliveness.
And if we look at the arc of the dream, he is restored to his young masculine potential.
It is through the woman that they get to the lobby where there are tables with computers and these packages in a corner.
Yeah.
So, and I'm thinking that computers are access to all kinds of communication and information, as well as these gifts. And you related it so well to Ghost of Christmas Past and Scrooge. There are new things here, things from the past to be retrieved, and new access to the world through computers. And then I'm thinking that he goes back alone into the structure and continued to wander. Wandering, by the way, is reminds me of Wotan wandering the earth, and it's mentioned so many times in this dream. The dream concludes with meeting two young men who lead him to his room, the place in this structure that is his, where he belongs. He's finally located somewhere in a kind of oriented or grounded way.
Right. I mean, the dream really ends on this very positive note. He finds his room.
Yes, where there is room for him in this structure. And my feeling about the dream is that it is so much about telos. It seems to point ahead to, okay, you have a room in a graduate school. It feels like the end of wandering because you have your own designated place, and that's a new beginning.
Yeah, and so he's ready to start learning now.
Yes.
It's really a remarkable dream.
The last bit that I would like to bring up is the word dormitory. The etymology of the word dormitory means the sleeping place, the dormitorium, the place where sleeping can happen, and by extension, dreaming can happen. And I think of the healing temples of Asclepius, where people would come from the ancient world seeking healing and solutions to problems. They would go through a kind of ritual purification, a religious orientation. They would sleep. And then the next morning, the priests would record their dreams, and out of that, create a kind of corrective formulary. The last part was the confirmation by the god. So they would take live serpents and suspend them near the ear of the person who was ill. And the serpent licked their ear. It was the sign that the god approved of the interpretation. So I'm finding that it's important that he locates the dormitorium, the place where he belongs, but also the place where he can dream. And in those dreams, perhaps find another level of healing in these 7 years since his husband has passed away.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.